Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, kicked out of their communities, we look at why some Native Americans are fighting to hold on to their citizenship. Imagine being part of a tribe, speaking the native language and joining in cultural events your entire life, only to be stripped of your tribal citizenship because somebody questioned your lineage. Now, this is called disenrollment, and for years it has affected thousands of Native Americans across the United States. Our digital producer Malika Bilal has been looking at some of the stories that are online about disenrollment. What are you seeing?
People are sharing what this means to them, what it means for their families. This is one tweet we got. This is from Johnny. She writes in, tribal disenrollment means abuse of sovereignty. It means assimilation and the lack of cultural tradition. So we want you to join in on this conversation as well. You can tweet us your thoughts using hashtag AJStream.
My name is Michelle Culhany. I'm the president and CEO at the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement, and I'm in the stream.
The impact of disenrollment on an individual or family is immense. Disenrolled members face loss of medical and educational benefits offered by the tribe. Some may have to relocate, even if they've had family living on the tribal land for generations. In February, a hashtag Stop Disenrollment Selfie campaign took off online, raising awareness and opposing this ongoing practice some have dubbed not traditional, not indigenous, and a threat to Native American identity. While tribe leaders assert disenrollment is meant to protect the integrity of the tribe, critics argue it's politically and economically motivated. So to help us talk about this, we're joined by Native Americans. In Michigan, we have Matthew Fletcher. He's a law professor at Michigan State University. Gabriel Galanda is an attorney working to advance tribal legal rights and Native American business interests in Seattle, Washington. Gyasi Ross is a storyteller who comes from the Blackfeet Nation, and he represents tribes dealing with enrollment issues. And Michelle Roberts is the spokeswoman for the Nooksack 306. That's a group fighting their disenrollment status. Good to have you here, everybody, to really appreciate the impact of what it means to be stripped of your tribal status. Gabe, I suppose you really have to understand what does it mean to belong to a tribe. Can you help us out with that feeling of being part of a community?
Yeah, before Columbus showed up in 1492, or before there was modern American government, indigenous peoples in today's America identified as a matter of belonging or kinship. It wasn't as a matter of blood quantum. It wasn't according to federal censuses. It wasn't according to federal land records or other colonial or federalist norms. It was based on relationship, intermarriage, adoption, and critically, inclusion and belonging. And that normative notion of indigenous identity has been flipped on its head over the last 2 centuries, thanks to the United States.
Sure, and blood quantum is like how much percentage of your lineage you can trace back to either your mother or your father or a grandfather was actually part of a Native American tribe. For you, Matthew, how do you know that you're Native American?
I know because my mother and my grandmother and my aunties all told me I was. And they told me in great detail where we came from, who we are, what we do, the right things to do and say, and how to behave. Those are things that tell me what makes me an Indian.
Sure.
You know, Matthew, you're not the only one. We got this tweet from Ruth, who says, historically, tribes were nations where identity was assumed by lineage, by marriage and involvement. Native was as Native does. We also got another personal story, this one from Shannara. She says, DNA testing and historical documentation confirms my family's Native American heritage, regardless of federal and tribal recognition. So Michelle, she mentions documentation. Not every family will have that, but you do. What would that look like?
What does our documentation look like? Well, we did a lot of research, and I'm the same as Matthew, that our grandmother told us for years, and as growing up, we've always been Native American. When we started getting questioned by the council is when we started doing more of the research and found actual paperwork and documentation as far as oblates, which is records from the Archdiocese, the 42 census or censuses prior to that, because basically the Nooksack tribe their enrollment goes off of the 1942 census. But there's a lot of other paperwork that goes along with proving that you have Native American in you.
See, Gyasi, let me just bring you into this conversation. What has paperwork got to do with your heritage, your lineage, being part of, you're part of the Blackfeet tribe? What has paperwork got to do with that? Isn't it about where your ancestors lived?
Was the question paperwork?
Yeah, what's that got to do with anything?
Well, unfortunately or fortunately, the judgment doesn't really help. But this is a nation, a consumer nation, where things have been historically and seem to want to be quantified. And the role of paperwork actually was considered a demerit at one time. Somebody who was a high degree of native blood was a person who could not, they were deemed incompetent to alienate their land, and thus weren't part of the common American economic system. So it's kind of flipped on its head from where it once was. It was actually at one point an insult to have that paperwork.
So then suddenly you're expected, Gabe, with tribes asking for paperwork, you're suddenly then expected to produce paperwork that historically wasn't necessarily a good idea or available. How do you even do that? What happened where people now are in tribes and people are saying, actually, we're not so sure that you are a member of this tribe? Can you explain that historical background?
Well, first and foremost, the truth has nothing to do with these disenrollment matters.
Right.
You can provide, as I have, any notion of proof or evidence or fact or truth, and the folks doing the persecuting or the disenrolling don't care to know the truth. But typically what is asked of folks like Michelle is to go back several generations to a time period when Indians weren't really even treated as citizens, nor were women. And for example, for the descendants of a treaty chief for the Grand Ronde tribes, unless they could find a birth certificate or a death certificate for Indian matriarchs in the late 1800s, the current politicians in the tribe will not deem them tribal, despite every other indicia of them being tribal. And really what the tribes have done is they have absorbed federal notions of identity as their own. Federal roles, federal censuses, federal land records, federal notions of blood quantum that derive from places like England. And they now treat them as if they are indigenous, and they are not indigenous to us.
Picking up on that notion, Gyasi, I hear you, and I want to throw you something, because picking up on the notion of what Gabe just said, Ruth here agrees. She says enrollment was created by the federal government to keep track of tribal members and to keep track of who received treaty benefits. And she goes on to say blood quantum is also a federal government invention, and it's not as much a mark of tribal identity as it is a countdown to extinction. Gyasi?
Yeah, first of all, factually, just numerically, that's inaccurate. And how do we know that? Because 1887, when blood quantum was instituted, there were less than 250,000 Native people in the United States. Now there's 2.5 million. And so, that extinction has not happened. But the problem with what Gabe is saying, and he's absolutely right that we have taken on these notions, and we should always question these colonial notions, but is that it's overbroad. And so it treats one situation of disenrollment as if it's indicative of all situations of disenrollment. For example, there's absolutely situations where people have fraudulently joined tribal roles. And, in those instances, there are tribes who are treating themselves as nations, as all nations do, including the United States, including France, including Canada, including the UK, where they can absolutely revoke citizenship for certain specific offenses. Specifically, here in the United States, those offenses include if a person falsifies or conceals relevant facts related to their citizenship. And I think that we should always question why we would want a native nation to be treated less than one of these other nations. I'm a true believer in native nationhood, and I think we have to always bolster and booster the ability of native nations to be treated equally with these other nations.
See, Gabe, is that relevant, the fact that some people might be saying they're part of a tribe so they get the benefits that come along with being in a tribe?
Yeah, that's not irrelevant, but to respond to Gyasi, and Gyasi and I have these debates amongst ourselves as friends, so this is fun to do it now in front of an international audience. I want to draw an analogy to the United States Constitution and the Fourth Amendment, which protects somebody's citizenship absolutely. And the U.S. Supreme Court has said you cannot have your citizenship tampered with by politicians in Congress. It is an absolute guaranteed right, and it's here, not to harken back to what the presidential candidates are talking about necessarily, as a matter of your birthright. If you are born here, you have citizenship, and it is guaranteed and cannot be stripped by Congress under the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And it doesn't matter. Well, I think you're talking about naturalization, where there can be revocation.
You can revoke natural-born citizens if and this goes for many nations within the Western world. I'm not saying that's the right standard, but what I'm saying is that if we're going to do it for tribes and question their ability to, if somebody falsifies or conceals relevant facts related to their citizenship, and say that the tribal nation should not be able to do it, I think we should likewise question why other nations can likewise do that.
Let our audience understand what it's like to go through this process. So, Michelle, Gabe is actually representing you. He's representing you because what? What's happened to you and your family?
So back in February of 2012, the council decided to take a look into our paperwork. One of our cousins was trying to enroll their nieces and nephews or their children, and the enrollment officer denied it, and so it was brought to the council table asking whether or not why they're denying the enrollment when all of our family's been enrolled. And that kind of opened the door for the council to look into other paperwork within our family when they should not have.
What was behind that, Michelle? Do you know?
There has been always a long-time family feud in Nooksack, and it just stems from that.
Mm. So when you're being asked to prove that you really do deserve to be part of the tribe, what was the evidence that you came up with?
We came up with basically, my grandmother telling us that we were. We have paperwork from, like I said, the Archdiocese, the Oblate records, censuses that show where Madeline and Annie lived in the same household. We actually reached out to anthropologists, Bruce Graham Miller from UBC and Jay Miller from University of Washington. We looked at the Fletcher notes. We've looked at the Broadman rolls. We've done so much research in all over between Canada and the U.S. and even went over to the Mormon over in Utah.
Right. So you did some serious digging about your family. And do you have any doubt that you should belong to this tribe?
Absolutely no doubt at all. None.
Matthew, we heard Michelle talk about the process of disenrollment. We also heard from someone online whose family has already been disenrolled. This is Rick, and this is what he told us happened to his family.
My tribe, the Pechanga Band of Luiseno Indians, has my family who are descended from an original Alati still living on the reservation. However, they have lost the right to vote. They have lost the right for health care provided by the tribes, the right to per capita. They can no longer use the restrooms on the reservation. They cannot use the playgrounds. They have the right to be detained by the tribal rangers. This is America. This is Indian country. This is apartheid.
Matthew, I'm wondering your thoughts on that. I know you served as a judge on another disenrollment case. What kind of stories did you hear then?
Well, I think it's useful to compare the kinds of tribes that you hear about, especially in California, versus Nooksack. And I'm not going to try to justify what Nooksack is doing. But Nooksack has a judiciary. They have judicial review. And that is a completely different world than when you have with a tribe like Pechanga, which is my understanding does not have a judiciary, does not allow for judicial review. And that's an important distinction. I think it's fairly rare for tribes to be successful in engaging in illegitimate mass disenrollments where judicial review is a possibility. And the mere fact that the Nooksack 306 are still kicking in terms of their status as tribal members, 4 years now after being targeted for disenrollment, really goes to the mere fact of the judicial process. And there's only a couple of 3 tribes that I know of, maybe a couple more that I don't know of, where mass disenrollments are rushed through a judicial process. And I think it's a big deal. I've sat on a disenrollment action at my own tribe, and it wasn't any fun, and it was a very difficult and intense thing to do. But in some ways, it was one of those cases that Gyasi's talking about, which was a case of accident or fraud where somebody was, as far as we could tell through the evidence, was improperly disenrolled, and they had more than 10 years of an opportunity to research their lineage to prove it to the tribe, and they were just unable to do that.
Gabe.
And so this is the difference.
So Gabe, do you see a pattern with the disenrollments? Do you see, everybody's got a slightly different story, but do you see a pattern with which tribes are disenrolling a lot of people? Can you say, oh, I know why this is happening, it's because of this reason?
It's because of greed, in particular gaming per capita greed in places like California. And it's also because of power mongering at places like Nooksack. And sadly, disenrollment is trending, meaning it is trending towards more disenrollment, towards a greater degree of epidemic concern. And the numbers are hard to pinpoint, but it's between 8,000 and 10,000 Indians have been disenrolled by as many as 80 tribes, which is 15% of all American recognized tribes. And that's in 20 states. So the data is imprecise, it's hard to pin down, but it is heading in the wrong direction and rapidly.
There's something, go ahead, Matthew, I can see you're about to jump in, go ahead.
Oh, I wasn't going to add anything, but I would say that those numbers, I hear those bandied about a lot, yes.
There's something quite unique about this situation because tribes, Native American tribes in the United States, they have sovereignty. So if they decide that this is the law, that is the law. Gabe, how do you fight cases if that's the situation? Who else do you go to if you don't go to the tribes?
Well, candidly, we've been brainwashed as Indian people by the United States over the course of the last 2 centuries to think that disenrollment is normative as a matter of our indigenous ways. It is not. Deciding who belongs, who is included, is an indigenous construct. That's kinship. That's belonging. Decided who does not belong, who is excluded, who is disenrolled. Incidentally, there is no indigenous word I know of, having talked to many people about this, for the word disenrollment. That is a construct of the United States that was foisted upon Indian people, chiefly since Indian reorganization. And so fundamentally, it isn't an inherent sovereignty issue, as some tribal politicians or even everyday Indians might lead folks to believe. It is a colonial turned federal construct that is designed to extinguish us as Indian people. And so first and foremost, we need to be educated and re-educated about exactly what this device is, where it came from, and what it is doing to us as Indigenous peoples in 2016.
On that point of...
Can I
go ahead.
Add something to what Gabe said?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an interesting concept. And while it's true that disenrollment is absolutely a colonial concept, so is enrollment. Having to prove or quantify your place within a community by a card and not by participation is a very colonial concept as well. So it seems odd that we're countering a colonial concept with a colonial concept, saying, well, people should be enrolled, but not disenrolled. There's analogies, of course, as Gabe correctly alluded to, kinship and inclusion into the community, which actually requires geographical participation. But there's also an analogy, to exclusion and disenrollment, which is banishment. And that's something that many communities did. So I think that when we're talking about terminology and we're kind of playing fast and loose with indigenous concepts, we have to be honest that we're always speaking by analogy, that disenrollment and enrollment are both colonial concepts. And if we defend one, well, then it seems like it opens the door for perhaps the other one to exist.
Michelle, I want to throw you something. This is a comment we got from Michael Kicking Bear. He's of the Native Opinion podcast, and he was actually talking about this very issue not in the recent past. And so he sent us a little outtake of one of his podcasts. This is what he told us. I want you to hear what he said.
Here's another angle, I think, that a a lot of these tribes don't think about either. With so much effort being made out there to try to get us to be not friggin' invisible people anymore, why the hell are you going to turn around and make your numbers smaller?
So he clearly feels passionately about that, and he raises a point that Gabe raised a little bit earlier. What do you make of that? Michelle?
About reducing the numbers?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't agree with that either. We're already a race that's bound for extinction because of disenrollment and because we have to prove that we are Indian. 100, 200 years from now, we could be extinct just because of that. And the tribal governments now are enabling that and helping it out. I don't believe that anybody, once they're registered or enrolled and prove their enrollment, that anybody should be able to question that.
I want to show Michelle.
Especially when we have so much documentation.
Yeah. I want to share, Michelle, with our viewing audience, some of the selfie campaign about Stop Disenrollment. And you can just see, as people write on their hands, the things that are very important to them. Down here it says, I need friendship. I'm just going to click through just two more here. Forced assimilation and termination. This is how this Native American feels about being cut off from their tribe. And then one more is that importance of ancestry, your ancestors. Can you explain emotionally what you're going through, not being sure if you'll be able to stay part of the Nooksack tribe?
Well, it's very difficult right now, and especially living in the community. Others probably don't feel it as much as we do, but if you're living within the Deming area, Whatcom County area, you live with these people that are actually speaking bad about you or targeting you, and these people that have been our friends for years and years and years, and going back to when we were children, and our children's children have grown up knowing them as aunts and uncles. And then for them to turn completely around and basically are, sending hate messages and attacking us like we are, I don't even know how to describe it, but it's really, really hard to actually live up here and have to walk by somebody that you've gone up and hugged or gone to their parties, weddings, births, and stuff like that, and you're not even acknowledged anymore.
Do they not talk? Do they not talk to you? Do they not speak to you, Michelle?
No, there's a huge part of a group of people that decided that we do not belong, that we've had friendships, like I said, for years. I mean, there's somebody that was at my wedding, 25 years ago, and we used to talk pretty much daily. We don't talk at all.
Gyasi, you were going to say something. Go ahead.
No, that wasn't me.
Oh.
It was me.
But
It's Matthew.
oh, okay, Matthew, please. Sorry.
Malika.
So I wanted to add that we have to keep remembering, I don't think the question that you asked earlier was completely answered, and the question is, why is this happening?
Yeah.
And one of the reasons is, not the reason, but one thing we need to consider is that, as far as I can tell, every single tribe that is engaged in mass disenrollments, every single tribal council or tribal elected leader that supports that has been elected for that express purpose.
Ooh.
These are all people put in positions through elections. And we've talked about disenrollment and enrollment being a structure that didn't exist traditionally.
It's a whole process that's established
did elections.
to deliberately take people out of their tribes. All right, Matthew Fletcher, Gabriel Galanda, Gyasi Ross, and Michelle Roberts, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. We're not done with you yet. We're taking you online, and we'll be at stream.aljazeera.com to continue this conversation. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care. Hello again, this is the Online Post Show. We're going to get back into this conversation about disenrollment and Native American tribes. Gabe, you haven't got a result yet from the cases that you're picking up, and in fact you never wanted to take up disenrollment cases in the first place. Why are you now fighting for people who may be disenrolled?
Yeah, I mean, 3 years ago when Michelle's family called, I referred them out because I had kind of a gut reaction that this was just ugly stuff. And I, at that point, had been brainwashed to believe that this idea of disenrollment was an inherent indigenous idea that tribes had the prerogative to carry out. And since then, I've seen the absolute injustice to indigenous peoples that's caused by disenrollment. I've seen the worst pain and anguish and the lack of due process at law, the lack of any notion of civil democracy. I've seen tyranny and dictatorship. I've seen greed and corruption. And I now have a staunch belief that it needs to be stopped. And it needs to be stopped before, candidly, we self-terminate ourselves out of existence by federal design.
Matthew, I mean, you brought up this point right at the very, very last second of the show, which is that there are actual groups that are put together specially to disenroll people. Behind that, do you feel that, it's just about money and benefits?
Well, I don't know why. I've never really been able to vote in my own tribe's elections because I don't live on the tribe's reservation, and so the tribal political processes are a bit of a mystery to me. But my sense is that in disenrollments here with a tribe in Michigan, people run on a platform of, but they don't say disenrollment, they say revisiting the membership or auditing the membership. And those are key terms. There are reasons why people bring those things up, and it's probably due to the things that Gabe is saying. It's greed, it's trying to limit benefits for people that are on the political outs. And sometimes that's really stark. That's actually what's happening. But keep in mind, traditionally, we didn't necessarily select our leaders to do that sort of work. And we also had the right to exit, which is closely related, is the opposite side of the same coin as the consent of the governed theory, which is we could leave if we don't like what's going on or if we're no longer welcome, and we could find another community. Now, because of history and law and the way things have progressed, Indian people don't necessarily have the right to exit anymore. If they're excluded from their tribe, they may not have another tribe with which to hang on to.
You know, Gabe, there's something here that was mentioned a little bit earlier, but I want to bring it back to this. This is Polly Grandmother on Twitter, and she raises this question. She says, I'd like to see the cause better defined. What if someone enrolled under fraud back in 2005? Shouldn't they be disenrolled? She goes on to say the Cherokee Nation might have had as many as 10,000 enrolled based on fraud. And Polly Grandmother is, she does this for a living. She is a genealogist, she says on her Twitter handle. You can see her bio there. So what do you make of that, actual fraud happening?
Well, then I say shame on the tribal government and the people who elected tribal politicians and the tribal politicians who put staff in place to run an enrollment department. If they allowed people who did not properly descend from the tribe to be enrolled, shame on the government. But to now tell a 5-year-old boy at Nooksack who believes he's Nooksack that he doesn't belong because some modern tribal politician wants to exile his family, that's wrong. You have to live with the consequences if there was bad governance and bad tribal decision-making, and remedy it on a go-forward basis, but you should not go back retrospectively and steal the current generation's identity.
Gabe and I have talked about that specific fact pattern before, and Gabe and I feel just 180 degrees different. And I think it's interesting. Gabe is a business owner, very successful Native attorney, one of the best Native attorneys in the country. He's my guy, and he's really good at what he does. But if he hired somebody with fake credentials that faked their way, that said they were from Yale University, and in fact they went to DeVry Law Tech, Gabe is probably going to not, wait until on a go-forward basis to remedy that situation, but instead he's going to rectify that situation right away. And moreover, I think it's interesting when we expect different treatment. Once again, the United States has an ability to correct that exact fact pattern if somebody fraudulently enters into a citizenship, uses fake credentials, And I think that reeks of white supremacy when we say all these other people can do this particular thing, but Native people, we have a different expectation, and that expectation is going to be something less rights. The Native nation has less rights than every other nation in the universe. I think that's a very dangerous pattern.
I want to show you a picture on my laptop. This is a protest by the Nooksack 306. So, do you see it there? Okay, I just want to go back to Michelle. Michelle, do you think you're going to win your case? How's the campaign going?
The Stop Disenrollment campaign?
Yeah.
Oh, I think it's taken off. I've gotten so many, excuse me, I'm losing my voice, so much support from other tribes and other people that have contacted me personally and saying, you know, we support you. We're out here we'll do anything that you need. And so what we ask of people is, you know, to just continue to write into Congress or the Senate or the Secretary of Interior, the BIA, trying to get them involved to understand how our civil rights and our human rights have been violated by the tribal government. I keep hearing, you know, fraudulent enrollment, but when we and others can prove with the documentation that we have, all the history that we have, and it's still discredited, that is really disheartening. It's really inconsistent and unfair to the people that are truly Native American, and that we have it running through our blood, but yet they want to deny us that fact, even though we have proven that. So if there's other fraud, I'm not quite sure. If I've never heard of any story of being fraudulently enrolled, so I don't know what kind of documentation that they would have brought forward. But for the different tribes that I've been exposed to that have disenrolled or in the process of being disenrolled, they have a lot of proof that they descend from who they say they descend from.
Sure.
But the tribal councils discount all of that.
And the BIA that Michelle mentioned is the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Malika.
Well, I'll end with these two tweets. One person who points out that this is a complicated situation. TVA says the disenrollment issue is twofold, and that first part is that it has been used by councils to remove repeat and dangerous individuals. On the other hand, that second part, this is a tweet from Lisa, and she says, you can go to sleep a Native American, connected to community, and then you can wake up having lost it all because of trickle down, what she calls supremacist politics.
All right. I know this conversation will not end here. It will go on and on. Matthew and Gabe and Gyasi and Michelle, thank you for being on the stream today. Really appreciate it.